the new highest paid linebacker. Can somebody get Fred Warner on the horn here? The new highest paid linebacker in the NFL. That's where we wanted to start. That's where we wanted to talk, Sam. 24-year-old former BYU linebacker, Fred Warner, now the highest paid linebacker in the NFL. There's a breakdown over at PFF.com. And when we do those breakdowns, sometimes we tap into Mr. Brad Spielberger, our contract expert. There are some interesting numbers there showing essentially the discrepancies as linebackers have started to get paid more than safeties relative to each of those positions. Brad makes the point that both of those positions generally got paid in the market moved together, but there's a growing discrepancy in linebacker contracts. And we've talked a lot about that on the podcast here, how maybe linebacker is the most difficult position in the NFL right now. I was going to ask that to Bobby if we ever got him on the show. I don't know if Chris asked him, but if Bobby ever shows up, we'll ask him that question. How difficult is it to play linebacker now? And, traditionally linebacker is seen as a devalued position, but is it more valuable than ever given how much they're attacked in the NFL?
Yeah, I mean, my instinct says it's become a little bit of both. So linebacker generally, I think, is becoming a little bit devalued. And this idea of, you grab those guys in the first round, they'll make an impact to your defense and transform things. I don't know if that's true anymore. And I think more and more linebackers coming into the NFL are struggling earlier in their career until you eventually see, what they're capable of. Look at a guy like Roquan Smith, right? Roquan Smith was one of the best coverage prospects we've seen come into the NFL, this perfect linebacker for the modern day NFL coming out of Georgia. And, you take Roquan Smith high in the draft. We're in year 3, year 4 now for Roquan. And we've only just started to see him show up as the kind of the NFL player that his college tape said he was going to be. So it's taken a while for a guy even as talented as him to make that kind of positive impact on a defense that you need at that position. So generally, I think that level of play, all linebackers are getting lit up almost throughout the NFL. So if you're drafting one of those guys in the top 10 and they're not making that much of an impact versus whatever other linebacker you had in that spot, otherwise, it's not giving you a great return on your investment. On the other hand, if you do hit on one of the few guys that are capable of still moving the needle, whether it's Bobby Wagner, whether it's Fred Warner, whether it's Eric Kendricks, if you get one of those guys, they are still materially changing how an offense attacks you. They are actually affecting games. And, Kendricks is a great example. You can point to specific games, that 49ers game, which they ultimately went on to win quite handily. But for the first half, Eric Kendricks was affecting that game and, causing Jimmy Garoppolo all kinds of problems. And he's done that in multiple games for the Vikings. Fred Warner did it in multiple games last season for the 49ers. If you get one of those guys that's able to play with his head above water in today's NFL, those are still, I think, very valuable. But the position across the board, I think, is becoming devalued.
Yeah, so just for some perspective on where Fred Warner is. Last year, he played over 970 snaps. Run defense, overall defense grade, 88.6. Coverage grade was over 90, though. And I think that's the key here in today's NFL. His athleticism, his functional athleticism, right? I mean, when you talk about athleticism, it's not just 40 time. It's not just straight line speed. It's how does that show up on the field? Fred Warner is fantastic at getting range. We always talk a lot about how linebacker range is crucial. Their ability to get depth and avoid giving up big passes behind them, but also, closing quickly on the stuff underneath them. Just passer rating's not a great stat for linebacker, but it's one of those things when it's really good, it probably tells a story. That was Luke Kuechly throughout much of his career. The grade probably told a better story, but Fred Warner has done a fantastic job from a passer rating against standpoint, limiting big plays at linebacker, where those guys are generally attacked a ton. Run defense grade was okay, and he could do some damage as a blitzer. And I think that's the key for these linebackers, right? Warner last year, by our wins above replacement metric, number 4 in the NFL, 4th most valuable linebacker in the NFL last year, but he's trending in the right direction. He's still young. It is a position where I think, like a Roquan Smith, maybe it does take time, but this might be the time to lock up a Fred Warner. The other argument I'm going to make is the general analytics community tends to say, no, get your corners, right? Cornerback is the place where, coverage is the most important thing in the NFL as far as defense goes. It's more important than pass rush. You got to have good corners. You can't have a weak link in your cornerback room, essentially. But the argument I would make for Fred Warner is the scheme. In the situation, that does matter. I'll pull some numbers out on this in a minute. But zone-heavy schemes do matter more for linebackers. And a lot of our numbers have shown, even though we always talk about zone coverage for cornerbacks, being a skill set, that it's not the same as playing man, it is more difficult to play man overall in the NFL. Those guys do get torched far more often when you're playing man. But in zone, the linebackers in a zone-heavy system, cover 2, cover 3, quarters where you do have one-on-one matchups a lot, the linebackers do have a lot of pressure on them. We talk about it with the Steelers a lot. Those guys get attacked, and if you have a weakness, they get attacked even more. But if you have a strength at linebacker like a Fred Warner, it is an asset. So I don't think the contract is as egregious as maybe the nerds would suggest, Sam.
Yeah, and it's also, it's working out as like a 3-year deal with some big money, which isn't horrendous, even if the whole thing goes south. I mean, the first point I think is that, look, Fred Warner's stock is never going to be higher than it is coming off last year, because right now, if you look at his career, it's that perfect developmental snapshot, right? It's, intriguing prospect, talented guy, gets better, and then boom, year 3, breakout, best linebacker in the NFL. Now's when you cash in. Now we get this guy locked in for the next, X number of years, and we have the cornerstone of our defense. But as we know, it doesn't always work like that. And just because a guy had a career year in a contract year, or a career year, that led to this big contract, it doesn't necessarily mean he won't regress next year. And when you start writing up the best young linebackers in the NFL, they're full of guys that did that had this great year and then went south, right? Deion Jones is still only 26. We're now, 2017 was his sort of Fred Warner year, if you want to phrase it like that. And then he went backwards. It's not like he became bad, but he didn't maintain that 90 coverage grade year on year on year, because it's really hard to do. Darius Leonard, enemy of the show, friend of the show. Same thing, right? His rookie year, I think, was his best year, and he's kind of not maintained that level year on year. He's been good, but not great since that. So Fred Warner played amazingly last year, was as good as it gets in the NFL. If you were a betting man, I would put my money on him playing significantly worse than that in 2021, not better, or not even at the same level. So from his perspective, like, you're never going to get a better opportunity of making the big money than right now. For the 49ers, none of this stuff happens in a vacuum. So, even if you played man coverage all the time, which nobody does anymore, you need a linebacker that can cover, right? You need a guy that can go one-on-one with Christian McCaffrey or whoever it's going to be out of the backfield. That's a desirable skill set. If you play more zone than man, which basically every team in the NFL does, in this scheme in particular, this sort of Seattle tree of cover 3, that is a nightmare for linebackers. Like, you need linebackers that have a huge amount of range, that understand zone concepts and zone beaters, and can get to the right spot to close these windows. Fred Warner can definitely do that. But also, with the exception of the Arizona Cardinals, pretty much every team in the NFL is really good at moving receivers to specific spots to get favorable matchups. So you think of a linebacker patrolling the middle of the field, only having to really deal with tight ends and running backs and the occasional slot receiver who's not that, big a problem. Those guys have to cover, AJ Brown and Julio Jones and, Justin Jefferson and Mike
Tyreek Hill,
and whichever elite number 1 receiver a team decides they can get a good matchup by moving into the slot and running him over the middle and into the linebacker's coverage area. So you can't just say, like, this guy covers the middle of the field and that's not that difficult a thing to do, and he's only doing it against like lesser weapons within the offense. That guy is going to have to cover elite number 1 wide receivers. And when it goes wrong, it's when you get people pulling up the tape and going, oh, any defense that has Julio Jones covered by a linebacker is just a bad play call. It isn't always. And if you have a guy capable of doing that and surviving, not going one-on-one, down the field on a post route, whatever, but just surviving and shutting out the window, right? And making the quarterback go to read number 2, that is a very, very valuable skill. And it's what Luke Kuechly was so amazing at for a whole, like a decade. And Fred Warner, at least on last year's evidence, is very, very good at that. And that is worth a lot of money.